I'd like to thank Lauren, Sarah, and Connie for their presentations. I think this is very exciting, and we have some pathways on how to move forward with the rest of the discussion. We have about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes left for questions and comments. And if there's time, questions from the audience. So I will remind you to please put your 10 card up so that I can see that you have a question. Don't forget to use your microphone like I did. And I think I'll start with a question to Sarah because it was very interesting what she just talked about with the avatar. So Sarah, it's definitely a novel concept to design a custom avatar based on a patient's live treating physician. Can you tell us more about this? And do you worry that someday your avatar will replace you?
Thank you, Phyllis. So the idea, like I mentioned, for the custom avatars came from all of the times that I felt like I wish I had time to have that conversation and didn't. And again, speaks to my initial point about having a way to educate all comers about clinical trials. So what can we do? What tools can we use? What tools can we develop that while patients are waiting, when their doctors are running behind in the waiting room, what are the things that they could be doing? How could we be utilizing the time more efficiently, right? And in this, I think, climate where there are so many burdens and demands on all of us, patients, providers, physicians, you know, we really have to come up with ways that technology can help facilitate all of the things that we want to do, but physically aren't able to do. And again, I'm sure many of you in the room, especially those of you who are physicians, will relate to the fact that sometimes you hear yourself having the same conversation with people again and again. So there are individualized elements of that which are unique to a patient, but generalized information about clinical trials, like what is a clinical trial and what, you know, where can you find information about it? What is informed consent? What is randomization? Oftentimes in my mind, I thought, well, what if I recorded myself and took a break and sort of played that? So I think this idea of the custom avatars speaks to the point that, you know, patients have this relationship of trust with their doctors. This is not meant to replace me in any way, shape, or form, hopefully. We'll find out. But really to help facilitate those conversations that I feel like I want to have, but maybe don't have enough time to have, that are more generalized. And then once patients have that background knowledge and information, I can speak to the things that are specific to them and their care.
I'll just add to that, this reinforcing the sense of efficiency to allow providers to spend the time on things that they need to spend the time on, and allowing some of the more general information to be done electronically so that the specific tailored conversations, they'll have time to do that. Many patients want to know, does my doctor support this trial? And that would sort of be an easy signal there if the avatar looks like the doctor. So I think that addresses two challenges that we're facing.
Any questions? Patty?
So I think it was Lauren that had it up, the different measurements that you made as far as like not only understanding, but appreciating, being able to reason, and then really feeling that they had a choice. So it's not just about the information being understood, but it's actually the next step that comes. And did you find a lot of differences there, or anything that you could, and I think the avatar might help with that, actually, the different ways of communicating and making sure that not only it's the information, but that they feel like they still have a choice.
Right. So want to certainly attribute that MacArthur scale to for assessing decisional capacity there and putting forth those 4 measures, and not just understanding. I think the understanding is necessary, but maybe not sufficient. So I think we hear a lot of that in the health communication world. So the personalization of it, I think the notion of reasoning through the decision and what this means for me is a very important part, because that's where we could affect retention. If someone doesn't reason through that in advance, when they get to the fact that they have to go give blood, or they have to go to the doctor's office, or other elements of what it means to them on their daily life, that's where we may see that they just signed, but they get out afterwards because they haven't reasoned through the implications of it. So I think the measurement of the impact of the work that we're all doing in health literacy is very critical. And I know that the field of health literacy has developed a number of different measures over the years, and I think we need to be doing the same thing here of assessing the interventions that we're doing to increase informed consent.
Thank you. Chris?
I love I love this research you're doing with the avatars and kind of the decisional tools, because that's really what informed consent should be, and I love this. So I'm wondering kind of long term, if you've thought a little bit longer term than just the next year with your studies, about the scalability of the tool to other places that aren't as well funded, and how you see that how you see this evolving over time, or what you'd at least like to see.
I'll start, and one of the things that we've been doing is building a library of assets that will have both generalizable content, which is more of the things that are common across different studies, like the randomization or placebos, and what that means, and then tailored elements to certain trials that might have the unique avatars, or it might be a certain medication that's specific. And by building this library, there will be a long-term path for efficiency, get quicker, and we can cut and paste and put things in. Some of the customization I think is important, so I don't think that would completely go away, including the voice, and it has to come from a particular protocol for a particular study. But the library, I think, would be an important part.
That's a great point. And development of technology is expensive. So this is a pilot study, and the next step is always a larger study, so you can look at those things. Yes, this seems like a great idea in our smaller group, but is it in some ways superior to what we already have, and is it worth that cost? So I think the next step is always looking for more funding for the next study, and then once you have that. But you ask a great question, and this is something that we've thought about a lot, or continue to think about, is fine, you have the larger study, and then how are you going to get this out there for everybody to be able to use? One of the strengths, though, about a lot of the stuff that we're developing, like I mentioned to you, is that it is, while it may be disease specific, it's clinical trial agnostic. So really you could take it to clinical trials, the majority of the concept, to across disease states. So whenever you develop materials like that, that's always more cost effective, because you can take that and apply it to other diseases and then specific trials without a lot more work.
Jennifer?
I'd like to, Jennifer Dillahay, I'd like to ask a little bit more about each of your experience with the patients. We kind of talked about this notion of informed consent means an empowered patient. But is that measurable, an empowered patient? And in your experience, what does that look like in the patients that you interact with in your studies? What is the difference that it makes for them that they become empowered, and how are we defining that?
So in our study, I meant like when we're doing informed consent and we're training the research assistants, they have to do teach back. The patient has to be, and you have to realize ours are behavioral studies, so they aren't as complicated as the cancer studies. I sit on our IRB, and I look at the IRBs that come through our cancer studies, and so ours is a minimal risk. But the key components are that the patient first and foremost knows they can withdraw at any time. It's not going to affect the way their provider treats them. Nobody's going to be angry with them. That's optional. And then they have to understand, okay, why am I signing up for this? We assume people know what colon cancer is, and we assume, we don't make any of those assumptions when we do it. So an empowered patient for us is one who knows what's going to be expected. They're going to get phone calls. They have to be able to tell you back. And they also have to be able to know that they can contact someone at any point and withdraw. that nobody, that it's not going to upset anything about the way their care is handled. And for us, that's what an empowered patient is.
I think information is power. And so when people have that information that helps them make an informed decision, that's one aspect of empowerment. So it's rewarding to see when someone is going through a consent form and we ask them a question to assess knowledge and understanding of that, and they first don't get it right. And then we go through and help review the material again, and then they're able to get the question right on the knowledge assessment. So that's one example of maybe a small way to empower people with information that ultimately then making an informed decision is empowerment to some extent.
I think as an investigator, patients that are engaged, that are informed, are more likely to be retained in studies. And there's, at least in the disease that that is my focus, the retention rate in clinical trials isn't particularly high. When we were talking about oncology trials, that's a different universe. So across the board, I think a simple measure sometimes is when people are engaged and informed and empowered, they're more likely to want to stay engaged in that whole process from start to finish. I find that a lot of times when I hear from colleagues, people choose to drop out of studies because they're frustrated because they don't understand some or a particular step. So instead of feeling empowered, like they could ask somebody or ask their provider or ask the research team, they would much rather just not go to the next research visit. So I think that's, if you're looking for something simple and measurable, our patients, at least I find, are very engaged throughout that whole process, and in fact remain partners even well after the clinical trial concludes with our research team and research staff. And I find that incredibly satisfying. I sometimes joke that we all of these patients could be the face for our program because they're so willing to share their experience with others. And I think that is really key for me, is that if you've had a positive, whatever your experience is, positive or negative, but whatever your experience is, if you're willing to share that with others, to me that feels that, or translates into the fact that you feel empowered to speak up and share your experience, whether it's positive or negative.
Nicole?
Hi, thank you. You guys are doing wonderful work. I have a question. Nicole Holland from Tufts University School of Dental Medicine. All of you mentioned some form of cultural tailoring of materials and of the process. I did see some visual representation and a little discussion of language, but in what specific ways, if you can give examples of how you are culturally tailoring the process, the materials that you're using?
So there are several examples that I can give you. Let me start with the American College of Rheumatology project that I mentioned, Materials to Improve Minority Engagement in Clinical Trials. I think a lot of, from our patient input panels, when we develop the materials, whether they're the print materials or the ones that are online or the electronic materials that I'm mentioning to you, a lot of the feedback that we get is that people want the faces that you're showing them to look like them. They want to be able to relate to that picture and say, well, that looks like me, or this doesn't look like me. And so that's been an important piece of making sure that when we develop materials, they apply to everybody else. And our patient input panels, when we're developing materials that are focused on our Hispanic patients, then every step of that process involves input from them. So from the time that we start developing to the end, they are giving feedback and input on all aspects of that process. And the same applies to the process of developing all of these electronic tools and into the avatar building. So every digital technology that we're also developing is going through the patient input panels, which has been really, really important. And I think also, it's not just this looks like me. There are a lot of, as you know, and we recognize, there are a lot of cultural, family, other beliefs that go into how people make decisions. And being mindful and thoughtful of that when we create materials and design tools is really important. And I think there's no way to know that unless you are including those people in the input panel and giving you input into saying, well, how does this look? And someone can then give you input and say, hey, this looks pretty good. versus this doesn't look good. And in terms of our experience, we've had plenty of times when our patient input panels have told us that this is a no-go. And that's very, very powerful because we'll have spent so much time on it. And so now we've sort of shifted all of that, and they're involved right from the beginning as we're starting to develop the materials.
So I would agree in the sense of it's not just the appearance of it is. I mean, one of the interesting things on the brochure we developed in the American Cancer Society one was, if you noticed on the R01 ones, there was a single person or group on there. It was either African American or white. And so we ask about that. And these are patients from rural areas. Does it matter to you? And in one of our focus groups, the participants went, it was several African Americans who said, don't just put an African American on there. We don't want to be identified as this disease. We want everybody there. So on that one, it was represented. When we developed the videos, they developed the script. It was how they would say it. It was their scenario that they wanted to see that they could that would resonate with them. And that's for us, one of the important things is on whatever study we're doing, it's not one size fits all. It's not one rural community fits all. I mean, it's looking at, which is why we do focus groups with every group that we do, because everybody's different. Their belief systems are different, how they were raised are different, and we want to incorporate that to the point that we possibly can so that the material is meaningful. And like she said, I mean, all in the brochures that we develop now, it's always patients who want to be in it. It's always, and she's exactly right. It's somebody who looks like me, I can identify. It's not somebody playing tennis on the front. When we do exercise, it's not somebody at the golf club, doing something that people look at and go, I don't even want to open it. I mean, that's the issue we have with our patients is, can you get them past the cover? Is it something that draws them in that goes, oh, okay, doesn't scare them, but I want to read about this.
Well, if there are no more questions, oh, hi, Deb.
I know, I always have questions. I guess I'm wondering, with the materials that you presented here, I mean, and I'm really glad to hear the word communication used, because we didn't really use it much this morning. And that's what we're talking about, is how to do better communication with both providers and patients. I'm wondering how some of the lessons that you're learning could be turned around that the roundtable could use as recommendations then for moving this forward throughout the medical and research communities.
So for us, part of it is just what I just said. It's not a one size fits all. We're very much into trying to do something that the key word is generalizable. Also, as we've said before, the literacy aspect of it, it's just the reading aspect is just the tip of the iceberg. It's, we could give out our brochures all day long. Our research assistants had to walk patients through it, because our patients with low literacy are going to toss it, regardless of how low it is. It is something that has to be continually communicated and teach back. Terry and I always talk about that teach back is old school, but it is the most effective way of finding out that, our patients understood it. But we're still changing, whatever we use in our next trial will change. Some things remain the same. There are key messages that providers, because we do focus group with it's a blend. It's what the providers want in it, as well as what the patients say that is important to them. And that's key. It's not we're looking at one side or the other. It has to be a coming to a meeting of what's important, what's the most important thing providers want to get out there, and then, how do patients want to hear it, and what is it that they need to hear?
Deborah, your point is excellent, and I've been thinking about that actually most of the day today, and I think I've had several conversations around that one with Barbara also, is that, there's a lot of people doing a lot of work that all can be more synergistic and a lot more cost effective and resource friendly, because again, a lot of these experiences are similar across the board when it comes to clinical trials. Even if you take that specific disease and put it to the side, that patient experience is similar, and so many groups can benefit from all the work that everybody is doing individually. So to answer your question, I think that is definitely something that would be great for the roundtable to think about, is how do you bring all of these efforts together to make this a synergistic process for everybody who's involved, because it makes little sense to keep reinventing the wheel in everybody's little space. That doesn't seem very useful.
To add to that, perhaps the roundtable can use their influence to remind the funders, the FDA and NIH and PCORI, who are engaged in this space, to continue to accelerate their efforts and coordinate those efforts, as Sarah was saying, to share that information and share the lessons learned across the different agencies. But the principal investigators on the study will do what's required by the funding agencies. And if the funding agencies are wielding the authority to say, you do need to use patient-centered approaches, you do need to measure patient understanding using the common rule, as Chris was saying earlier. The common rule is a great step forward, but if we're not implementing it and funders are not requiring it, then we're not going to have progress in this area.
Yeah, the only other thing, the last thing that I would say is, one of the things that I've noticed with NIH and with PCORI is, unfortunately, what's happened is they have pushed up the timeline. And so when you submit grants now, there is less of that ability to do focus groups and have some time to develop it. And it is more about, they want you hitting the ground running, they want you enrolling patients. And that becomes the push and pull for researchers who are trying to put that information in there to get the patient's perspective. Is it's great to say that you want the patient's perspective, but yet you want them up and running in 2 months.
And with that,
Yeah.
I'm going to call time. I'd like to thank the panel for their discussions, for their presentations. It's leading to a great discussion, and I've got my signal, so turning it back over to Larry.
We're going to reduce our break for 10 minutes, so we'll be back at 3. If it takes you longer, we'll start without you, but please feel free to come back.